Good morning or afternoon, depending on when you're watching this video, and welcome to an analysis of the chapters 4 through 6 in Douglas's narrative, and largely the allegories and symbols that Douglas uses to make himself not only a good writer, but an emotion engendering writer who grabs the attention of both a pro-slavery and, most importantly, an anti-slavery audience. So without further ado, now as we get started on this fine day at the beginning of the week, there's a lot of things I want you to pay attention to. So first of all, and I'm going to pause here in a moment for you to go do this, is on the Mudge page, located on the far right-hand side, is a PDF copy of the entire text of Frederick Douglass. So you can follow along and annotate as we move. Either you can take the notes on your computer. I prefer them in a notebook because then you actually have them. I might even ask you on Tuesday as a homework check to show me your notes. That's going to be an important way for you to gain some points as we move into this major week. So momentarily here, I'm just going to shoot over and show you where that is. So here I am back on the Mudge page with all the materials. Of course, by the end of this week, we're going to be adding semester 2 vocabulary, so make sure you again pay attention to those details. But this picture over here with American Gothic, which you see with my arrow, that's where I want you to go. And once you get here, and of course it looks a little bit crazy, but when you get here, I want you to move through these. You've got your 2018 slave narrative characteristics, but here is the full Frederick Douglass text PDF. So if I click on this real simply, it takes me over, as it will as soon as it loads, to chapter 4 so that I can begin looking at the overall text and the things I want you to pay attention to. While it is looking at this, or while it's loading, what I do want you to pay attention to is the definition of an allegory. Again, it's a symbolic representation of a character or event that really helps in the presentation of the novel. So if I move, there's 1, here's 2, 3. Now it takes me here to chapter 4. So this is where I want us to be in the actual text. So if I just pause for a quick moment, these are all things that you would have the opportunity to go through and review. So I'm going to, so as usual, I have my large set of notes in front of me, the things that I took when I was actually doing the reading. So when we look at chapter 4, right away in that first paragraph, we have the dismissal of Mr. Hopkins, and then we hire Austin Gore. Now, the name Gore is largely allegorical and stands for the absolute cruelty that a slave overseer can be sort of compared to. So we know that he's an allegorical character. So think about the dramatic context of why we would do that. Why Frederick Douglass would include such description in the second paragraph of chapter 4. So I always say, hey, we need to take a bit of time here to go over and look at his traits. Now, in that second paragraph of the reading, it says that he's proud, ambitious, cruel, and obdurate. So those 4 characteristics absolutely should be in your notes. We know that obdurate, which I looked up, or obdurate, is unmoved by persuasion or sympathy. So Douglass sort of works on creating an evil overseer, then the next one's even worse, then it's even worse, and it's even worse. So he increases that dramatic effect by introducing these different models of cruelty. Again, that's an allegory. So the name Gore, and later on Mr. Severe, these are going to be very specific allegorical traits that the author is using. So as you go through chapters 4 and chapter 5, and even a little bit in chapter 6, you want to look at the development of these characters and how we get to these allegorical traits. So like in my notes, it says, what are these traits? Now, if I hold this up, you should be able to see how it says, what are the traits that Austin Gore possesses? Again, that's where you come up with examples from the reading. That's the material I put on quizzes. that's the material I'm going to hold you accountable for on tests. So certainly some really interesting ideas. We know that the maxim, or sort of the motto of Austin Gore, is better that a dozen slaves suffer than that the overseer be convicted of having been at fault. So Douglas introduces Austin Gore to be that terrible example of the cruel overseer who does nothing to elicit sympathy from us as readers, does nothing to sort of give him solid qualities. Now, specifically, that's on page 32 of the hypertext I showed you earlier in this lecture. So if this is Austin Gore's maxim or his motto, how does this affect Frederick Douglass? How does it affect the way that Frederick Douglass tells the story? Well, you'll notice that on page 33, Douglass describes Gore as a perfect, impersonal model of slavery. A perfect, impersonal model of slavery, because he's so disconnected. So why does Douglass need to paint the picture of Austin Gore in such a way, and then create a couple of different examples to show us how bad he is? Now, your job is to come up with those examples. Probably in the homework assignment that you're going to have at the end of this, I'm going to ask you about those characteristics or those examples. I can give you one specifically. On page 33, we have the example of Demby, the slave who goes into the middle of the river to escape whipping. Now, it seems a natural human response to run away, but it's instead of an example of human sympathy and a character trying to escape sort of the cruelty of slavery, it becomes a blatant murder. So this impersonal model that Gore now represents shoots Demby in the middle of the river because he refused to come out, and uses Demby as an example. And Douglass goes even so far as to describe the brain matter floating in the water, appealing to our sense of sympathy, appealing to our sense of, ooh, that's really disgusting. So there's a lot going on there in those particulars that we want to pay attention to. So my notes describes Gore as a perfect impersonal model of slavery. Why does Douglass need to present this picture? The Demby example, the utmost cruelty. This is an example of irony and persuasion. More ironic because there's no criminal prosecution later on as you read through chapter 4. And of course, your homework is to read chapters 4 through 6 if you haven't already done it. I'm going to add 7 and 8, so this is going to help you in your reading. So it's a perfect example of a slave overseer who's not prosecuted for murder. Slavery establishes its own set of words. So the important thing here is to always provide you with proof of what I'm saying from the actual text. So the allegorical presentation of Austin Gore and his behavior is manifested, augmented, made greater because of what we see here on 34 in that text that I provided you. So after the murder of Demby in the river, he continued in his station as an overseer upon the home plantation. His fame was carried abroad, and his act was not even submitted to judicial investigation. So I look at this segment, and the idea is that white overseers and slave masters are not held to the same kinds of rules that everybody else seems to be in the country. Then again, it goes on. He was the guilty perpetrator of one of the bloodiest, most foul murders. He goes unwhipped of justice and uncensored by the community in which he lives. So there's no consequence for his particular behavior. And again, I think that's very important for us to understand. Now it goes on here and says, I speak advisedly when I say that killing a slave of any colored person in Talbot County or any colored person in Talbot County, Maryland is not treated as a crime either by the courts or the community. And we provide other examples. Thomas Landman, who killed his slave with a hatchet, and it goes on further. The wife of Mr. Giles Hick, who lost her temper and commits horrible, horrible kinds of acts. So, two really strong examples from chapter 4 to support this allegorical development of why slave masters function the way that they do. Or more importantly, that allows Frederick Douglass as a narrator to really pull on our overall sense of emotion as we look at the text. Now, I know that as we're going through these notes, this might be moving a little bit fast for you. Kind of hard to jump between the hypertext and your notes and what I'm talking about in the video. Perfect opportunity for you to take some time to reflect on these notes while you're at home. The video will be there. There's no play pause it. And the assignment I'm going to give you at the end of all this will certainly allow you to pull everything together and to make it seem sort of cohesive as you develop the details. So I think that's important. Now, if I move on to the next piece, this is about Frederick Douglass getting his leisure time. On page 38, we know that Douglass kind of goes into further detail on why these things matter. We know he leaves for Baltimore on page 38, and he gives us a specific bit of information about how he sits in the front of the boat and the irony of why he includes that particular detail. As he sees the world spread out before him, it gives him this false sense of hope that really is going to kind of contribute to his character as we go through the particular text. So again, that's on page 38. Find that in your text. Page 39, on seeing Sophia Auld, he says, "I wish I could describe the rapture that flushed through my soul." A second opportunity, since Douglass has left the plantation and moved to Baltimore, he hopes that his life is going to be better, that he's going to be better off, that he's going to have better choices. And if you remember, Mrs. Auld is the one who initially tries to teach him how to read and his ABCs. So he talks about how this leads to the foundation and opened the gateway to his subsequent prosperity. So he has all of this tremendous hope that he talks about on page 39 in that hypertext, that when he gets to Baltimore, everything is going to be better. As a matter of fact, on page 39 in the last paragraph, Douglass reflects on Baltimore as his first impression of freedom. So that's important, but it's going to give you an opportunity to look at something a little bit further on in the text. Now, chapter 5 was short. It has some fairly succinct information. So hopefully you took some notes on that and you have a good presentation of where you're going. Now, what you notice here as I move through this lecture is I've covered chapters 4 and 5. 4 in great detail, 5 not so much. 6 is also going to be short, so it gives you the opportunity to kind of make these connections on your own. So chapter 6, really all about Mrs. Auld. Really about what she contributes, what she offers us, the irony, all of this. So that first question is the same one I had for chapter 5. What is the portrayal of white women? For example, look at her description on page 40. How was she described? What do we get about her? What is significant? Is she tender and motherly? And all of those great qualities that a mother's supposed to possess. I think we start with that on page 40, but in the very next paragraph, she becomes pretty awful as she stays in slavery with the contributions of her husband, the contribution of society, and all of those kinds of things. She becomes more and more corrupt. So I think that's incredibly important as an idea for us to pay attention to. So in support of the argument that Douglas is making about the effect of slavery on white women and the effect on the sort of white family in particular, is we have this quote here from the hypertext on page 41. He would at once become unmanageable. This is the idea if he knew how to read, and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. Now, as I look at this particular element in the text, this is of great value, because what Mr. Auld is saying is that slavery ruins the slave. Yes, I know he's talking about reading, but the specific idea here is that slavery ruins the slave. I would make sure this particular bit of information was in my notes. And then I would come down here and I would say, from that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was just what I wanted, and I got it at a time when I least expected it. So this element of the story, and again, I have it highlighted here in that hypertext on page 41. This is really important because chapter 6 is the transition of Frederick Douglass from I'm just a regular, average, everyday slave to now one with an identity. While I was saddened by the thought of losing the aid of my kind mistress, I was gladdened by the invaluable instruction which, by the merest accident, I had gained from my master. Now, very significant, though conscious, I set out with a great hope and a fixed purpose of whatever cost of trouble to learn how to read. So right there, the third segment that you want to highlight in your notes is the idea that Frederick Douglass's narrative hinges upon this major point. Intelligence, education, the ability to read and to see forward into the future is all of tremendous value to him as a character. So you want to make sure you have that information in your notes. Okay, so just to review, here are the highlights that I wanted you to have in your notes. Something about the portrayal of white women and how they compare and contrast with each other. I wanted you to discuss the ironies Douglass includes to engage the reader. Probably should have 2 or 3. And then what about this idea of clashing the plantation life with the irony of city life? So those are like the 3 main ideas. Mrs. Auld, that I just thought that was something important, although by itself, I don't know if it's that absolutely valuable. Now look at what I want you to do for Tuesday, for tomorrow's class. Option number 1, develop an analysis for the women through chapter 6 of the narrative of Frederick Douglass. I would pick 3 minimum, 4 or 5 probably would be better. Option 2, develop an analysis for the role of self-reliance as it applies to Frederick Douglass's journey through the first 6 chapters of the novel. So that is absolutely tying you into transcendentalism and the ideas of Emerson and Thoreau. Option 3, choose a theme not listed here and write about it. Maybe something's grabbed you that is more awesome than what I've covered, so here you go. Now, what are the guidelines? I want 100 to 200 words. I want it handwritten. Begin with a thesis statement. Right now, I think the assignment should be due on Tuesday, but if we can't seem to handle it in class, it will be due by the end of the period. So stand by for how that works. Now, this is the end of the chapters 4, 5, and 6 video lectures. Have fun.